Hello and welcome to the third video in week 6 of ADMS 1010, Exploring the Functions of Business. In this video we will be looking at the chapter on underlying assumptions from the Critical Thinking textbook. So in this video we'll start by looking at underlying assumptions and the two different types. Then we'll consider what underlying assumptions might be found within the Competing on Resources reading that was assigned this week. Next, we'll consider whether or not there are any underlying assumptions in society at large. And lastly, we'll consider some alternative perspectives on those underlying assumptions. What are underlying assumptions? This is probably the most elusive topic in the Dyer textbook, so let's do our best to make it clear. Underlying assumptions fill the gap between evidence and claim. This can be tricky because it might not always seem as if there is a gap, and that the evidence clearly supports the claim that the author is making. However, there is still some wiggle room here. Another complicating factor is that underlying assumptions are rarely, if ever, actually stated within the text of an argument. So you have to go looking for them, in a way. One way to think about this is to ask yourself the question, what must be true if the claim is to follow from the evidence that was given? For instance, if I were to argue that dogs are better than cats as pets, and cite as evidence for my claim that more people own dogs than cats in Canada. I'm not sure if that's actually true or not. Would that justify my claim on its own? Probably not. You might think that, you might find that there is an underlying assumption here that being a better pet is associated with being more widespread. But there could be other reasons for that. For instance, working dogs on a farm, not necessarily meaning they're better pets, but contributing to the fact that they're more widespread. Another thing to consider is if there is a general principle justifying a claim, or, on the other hand, what the beliefs of the speaker might be. What values do they hold that could be influencing their approach to making an argument? You could also approach this a little bit more logically, separating the claim from the evidence and asking yourself, is it possible to believe the evidence but still disagree with the claim? If so, what connection is the speaker making behind the scenes that leads them to believe the argument is incontestable? Dyer notes two main kinds of assumptions, reality assumptions and value assumptions. Again, this can be tricky because the distinction is not always so clear-cut. Reality assumptions are those about the way things are or the nature of things. It is perhaps possible to change someone's assumptions about reality by pointing out new information to them. Let's look at another example. Suppose I were to argue that low oil prices mean alternative fuel vehicles are a non-starter, and cite as evidence for this claim growing sales figures for conventional vehicles. What underlying reality assumptions might I be holding? A couple. For one, I'm assuming that people are, by and large, not willing to change existing practices. But I'm also assuming that growth in sales of conventional vehicles is a trend that can't be stopped. And also, perhaps, that low oil prices are here to stay. In fact, there are lots of assumptions here, none of which are stated explicitly, and also none of which should be considered infallible. They are, which is to say that they are to some extent disprovable by looking at actual data. Conversely, value assumptions pertain to ideals and standards of what is right and wrong. They are implicit statements about the way things ought to be. Continuing with the automotive example, can you identify any value assumptions that could be motivating my claim? This can be a bit trickier because sometimes you need to infer what the intention of the overall argument is. The claim was that alternative fuel vehicles are a non-starter, but the related implied aspects of that claim are that there is no need to change the way things are at the moment. You might also infer a connection to concerns about climate change. Accordingly, value assumptions here might be that tradition is better than change, or that environmental concerns are misplaced and irrelevant. Identifying assumptions can be hard because it requires you to go beyond the information that is available to you. It requires you to make an educated guess at what other factors may be involved in the argument.
So now let's look at some underlying assumptions in the Wall and Maid article comparing performance and strategy of GE with Amazon. So first, what's the claim? Well, the article describes the relative performance of GE versus Amazon, attributing the difference to corporate strategy. The author first describes a bit about GE's strategy dating back decades, suggesting that the theory held that the right portfolio of business would earn a high return on shareholder equity and that the stock market would respond accordingly. But GE did not do as well as Amazon did during the time frame he's concerned with. His main claim is that Amazon's new corporate strategy model to bet on expectations beating revenue growth was more successful than GE's outdated one. He then gives some evidence about GE's economic performance and compares it with Amazon, whose stock value rose 108,778% during the same period, and discusses at length how Amazon's purchase of Whole Foods represents just such a gamble, contrasting implicitly with GE's focus on high profit potential industries. So what assumptions might be filling the gap between claim and evidence here? Well, let's do reality assumptions first. One thing that's important to keep in mind about assumptions, reality or value, is that they need not be right or wrong. They are simply unstated beliefs that tie an argument together. The author in this article is making a rather straightforward argument and gives straightforward evidence. But ask yourself, if the evidence he gives is really supportive of his claim, what things must hold? In the case of reality assumptions, it seems clear that his evidence on stock market performance would only support his claim about the superiority of Amazon's strategy if A, we assume that stock markets reward success rationally and optimally, that is, reflecting the true value of the company in question and not being predisposed to investor biases, unrealistic beliefs, global trends, or fads, and B, that what worked for Amazon would also work for GE, in effect that the same corporate model would work for all companies equally. You could go one step further and propose some assumptions that lay behind the last assumption as well. If the same corporate strategy would work for everybody, this reflects a reality assumption that the same principles of business underpin all industries. Some of these might include an assumption coming from economic thinking that scarcity and self-interest lead naturally to competition, or that large industrial size is indicative of success, or that competitive free markets make society better off. Remember, you don't need to agree or disagree with an assumption to propose it. Now let's look at value assumptions. For instance, the authors clearly hold an assumption that the purpose of being in business is to maximize profits and to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. This may seem like an uncontroversial statement to some, but Dyer does note that even though some values might be widely agreed upon, they are nevertheless still assumptions. It is certainly possible to believe in a different purpose for being in business. A related value assumption is that competition, efficiency, winning, and risk-taking is desirable in business. Again, Dyer discusses competitiveness as a value assumption in the text. Though competitiveness may seem like a fact of life, consider that there are alternative ways of doing things, either by cooperating or by going it alone, and measuring success by some standard you've set for yourself. So what about society in general? By this I mean, can we identify any underlying assumptions about the way business operates in the world? About the point of economic pursuits? Of course, this question is terribly broad and overarching, which makes it difficult to answer. To help, consider this small smattering of headlines. Do you see any common terms in these examples? Does anything stand out as being indicative of a broad underlying assumption about business and economics?
As was discussed in the video on economic thought, we might say that a central claim about business in the modern world is that the pursuit of economic growth is the main overriding priority of economic pursuits. This would be to follow in the footsteps of some of the strands of economic thought covered in the first video prepared for this week, and though it may seem justifiable, it is nonetheless contestable. How might we back up this claim? Well, we would need a measure of growth. GDP serves well. We could note that GDP growth figures occupy a very privileged space in discussions of economic development and are widely reported. We might also offer some analysis of global development, looking at GDP growth figures for developed and developing countries alike. Now, does this evidence support the claim? It appears to, but ask yourself, is it possible that there are some assumptions about the way the world is or should be that connect this evidence to the claim? Can you agree with the evidence but still have issues with the claim? Perhaps there is an underlying value assumption about economic growth in that it is synonymous with prosperity. On that note, it is worth noting that there are alternative perspectives on the priority of economic pursuits. For example, the recommended reading for this week by Richard Layard, proposes that we use happiness as a measure of prosperity rather than gross domestic product. Similarly, Tim Jackson, in his book Prosperity Without Growth and in the supplementary video posted this week, argues that in fact we can have prosperity without economic growth. Please check out these additional materials to get a more comprehensive picture of the place and purpose of economics and business in the world.